Not get excited about money. So please take a seat, grab your coffee. We have, we really got some very diverse, I think this is really also showing the power of interdisciplinary, as we were talking, approach or systemic investing, where you are bringing now stakeholders together that you wouldn't usually maybe actually have together in such an investing panel. Usually you have the same, the usual suspects. Maybe, they differentiate between either geographically or by the asset classes. I think here what we have in this group is actually a panel that has strategic investors, it has financial investors, it has financial advisors, it has people who are coming from different regions of the world. We have Europe, we have the US, we have Africa. We also have those who have, been raising various funding mechanisms. So we really got the whole demand-supply dynamic and a lot more. So to get started, and I think we've had a very interesting already set of issues come up over and over again, but to maybe get started, and we'll start basically on the strategic investor side. If we are looking at the investments that are going into neuroscience, brain R&D, and we'll start with Tarek. Lundbeck, one of the I would say most specialized global pharma companies in that space. What is it about neuroscience that makes it so difficult actually to bring the necessary investments and necessary ultimately treatments and products to market? What is Lundbeck doing? And how do you see yourself mobilizing more private capital in this space? I hope you have a microphone. Yeah, maybe.
Thank you for the question, and very happy to be here. Actually thrilled to be with an audience and panelists that are equally passionate about brain health and finding cures for brain diseases. So let me maybe, thank you for the question, and let me take a step back and maybe comment a little bit about the burden of brain disorder. We talked about brain health, the flip side of brain health, brain disorders and its burden on society in numerous fashions. I think I don't need to make a case to this audience. And this takes a big toll, and this burden isn't going anywhere. Whether or not we invest in it now, that could be debated, but the burden is going to be there. So sooner or later, we will have to tackle it. So why is it so hard to get enthusiasm to invest in neuroscience? Well, there are several factors, but let me draw a little parallel to start with regarding innovation in general. It's not very hard to stimulate and encourage innovation in technologies. It just happens. I think in an ideal world, innovation should be sustainable and should pay for itself in the long run. It might need an influx of capital in the near term, but overall, if you're solving societal burdens and problems, it should pay for itself. And we've been discussing early on what is the value of the brain? Actually, the question is, what is more valuable than the brain for a society? So what has been the problem in neuroscience, and why am I optimistic today? So first of all, maybe start by introducing a little bit myself. I head up research, corporate patents and trademarks, and all discovery work at Lundbeck Pharmaceutical. We're the only pharma company that is solely focused on brain diseases and finding cures for brain diseases. So easily, assume that we're a major stakeholder in this. So what has been the problem? I think one of the challenges is the complexity of the brain. And what has been tried, I can tell you what hasn't worked, and I can tell you why we're excited now, is approaching brain biology and neuroscience as a phenomenology, as opposed to a mechanistic understanding of a brain disease. And when you approach it as a phenomenon, on the one hand, you've got the drug that you'd like to test in a given disease, and there's this black box in the middle that we call the brain. And on the other side is the clinical endpoint. That could be behavioral, or could be any improvement in clinical outcome. And there's a big, as I said, black box in the middle. And that becomes a hit or miss. And another layer of complexity is for the good or the right reason, is how expensive clinical trials are. A phase 3 clinical trial in a neurodegenerative disease indication costs north of $1 billion for a phase 3. So how many shots at the goals with a low probability of success can you afford? And that has given that wrong reputation that neuroscience is hard. If neuroscience is approached that way, it is certainly hard. But if you approach neuroscience by capitalizing on the improvement and increase in understanding of the biology, focus on mechanisms that we know, due to the progress that we've made over the past decade or so, are contributing to the etiology of the disease, tackle those mechanisms. And as my favorite, it becomes the art of de-risking. I think it was mentioned by one of the speakers early on. Investment in innovation in neuroscience is the art of de-risking early. Letting the mechanism, letting the molecule that we're working on speak early, to know early on whether it's a worthy investment with a higher probability of success, or it's not, and then moving the resources, the capital, the investment into another project with a higher probability of success. And it's not a hard case to be made because patients are waiting. And it is no service to anybody waiting 5 to 10 years to realize, several $1 billion later that the drug doesn't work. So you want to get that information early. So I'm excited because now we are finally in a place where we can capitalize on the increase in understanding of the biology, put it to good use, come up with what we call biomarkers, which are early indicators of efficacy as early as a phase 1 clinical trial. And this can be transformative. You end up in a space where the probability of success is dramatically higher. And as I said, I'm optimistic. Why am I optimistic? If you look at the rate of approval in neurology and neuropsychiatry within the FDA in the US in the past 7 to 8 years, guess what would be the top 3 disease areas with the most approval in the US? Well, neurology and neuroscience is among the top 3. So neuro's coming back. Over 10, 15 years ago, there was this challenge. Many large players, pharma, exited the field. Well, guess what? They're coming back. They're coming back with the innovation, capitalizing on innovation. And it takes a village to bring a new medication for neurological diseases. And there are a lot of stakeholders. Academia is where most of the initial fundamental biology thinking occurs. Biotech, taking a little bit more risk, right? And bringing new concepts. And then pharma, they're very good at making drugs and running clinical trials. And then you've got regulators. You need an ecosystem. And there are a lot of success stories. If you see where we are, we have 3 approvals or 2.5 approvals for Alzheimer's disease, a number of approvals in other neurodegenerative diseases that were looked at 10 years ago as it's impossible to cure, it's too complex. We're seeing hopes also in psychiatry. The field of psychiatry, neuropsychiatry is back. So it's a great time. It's a great time for neuroscience. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I think we heard now a few catchwords that we will definitely need to build on. So ecosystem, the value of the ecosystem, and the de-risking and the various capital sources to do so. Therefore, moving to Alison, who has, I think, a lot of experience having worked with various funding sources for her organization and has sort of, experienced maybe what systemic investing could entail. Alison, would you maybe share with us sort of the experience that you have had in your organization, what you think can actually further bring these various funding sources together? And if you want to maybe share that. Yeah.
Thanks. So for people who don't know, I'm Alison School. I'm the president and chief scientist at the Center for Aging and Brain Health Innovation, as well as the Baycrest Academy for Research and Education. One of the few Canadians in the audience. Thank you for having us. If you don't know what Baycrest is sort of like the one-stop shop for all things aging in Canada. We've been around for over 100 years, founded initially as a small old person's home, and has now expanded to be one of the largest long-term care centers in Canada, as well as having continuing care hospital, focused on geriatrics, all kind of geriatric outpatients. We have one of the only, I think in the world, cognitive neuroscience research institutes embedded within that ecosystem. So we're co-located with long-term care and with assisted living and with independent living and outpatients. And we also have a lot of education work, and we also run this innovation center, which isn't just for Baycrest, but is for all of Canada and in fact for the world. And that's, I think, what I'll focus on here. And what CABI is, the Center for Aging and Brain Health Innovation, is really an innovation catalyst. And what we have done is, rather than take the approach of most, say, solution accelerators, which go at a certain technology readiness level, and go across a wide range of different areas, we focus in this aging and brain health space, and we cut across the entire innovation cycle, from development and design all the way through validation and refinement, through spread scale and adoption. And so we have different kinds of programs at each of those different kinds of levels, and then that means that we need to have different kinds of funding for the different kinds. So we go all the way from, we talked about the 4P, the private, public, philanthropic partnerships. We have sort of all of those included here. So at the earlier stages, one of the things we want to do is not to duplicate any of the kinds of programming that's available, say, from the government agencies. So, for example, for us, it would be NSERC, or CHR in the United States is NSF and NIH. We complement what they do, and we also support groups that aren't necessarily fundable by those agencies, because some of the best innovations come not from people like me. I'm a neuroscientist by trade. They come from the people who are frontline care workers, who are spending day in and day out working with people who have neurocognitive deficits, who don't think of themselves as being innovators, right? So we try to train them, how do you think of yourself as an innovator? Take what works for you and see, could we develop this into something? So those are our earliest stage kinds of programs. And then for people who've got a little bit of an MVP and want to see, is it going to work in the real world? We've got validation testing. And then, of course, we can do equity investments as well. So we bring in different groups at different stages. And at the equity investment phase, we are limited in what we can do right now, because we're working mostly with public sector funding for that. But then we partner with other venture funds and investors on that. And we actually are looking to start our own venture fund that's really targeted in this space now, to be able to take that to the next level. And the thing that's really nice about our approach is, because we go across that entire pipeline, the innovation pipeline, we can take people who start off here. For example, one of our innovators started with this early term program when she was a speech and language pathologist, and she wanted to know, does this communication project that she's working on, would it actually make sense from an innovation perspective? So we helped her with supporting that. All the way through now, we've invested in her company. She's quit her job as a speech and language pathologist, as a full-time CEO founder. And I just took her on a trade mission with Canada to the Asia Pacific region, and she's spreading and scaling not just across Canada, but globally now. That happened within a couple of years. And it happened that quickly because we were able to piece together different kinds of funding approaches and follow somebody through that entire trajectory. The other thing that's really important, I think, to keep in mind there, and this comes back to some of the discussions that were raised earlier, is the notion of these ecosystems, right? So because CABI works in the context of Baycrest, which has been around for over 100 years, and knows who all the players are in the aging and brain health space, if a company comes to us and says, you know what, I need to have this tested in the real world, we know who are the right sort of partners for them. And then the last thing is, we can also say, because we've invested over $160 million in these kinds of projects since 2015, and just to note, it does make money. because the companies and the projects we've invested in have on top of our funding gone on to bring in another $750 million in follow-on funding during the last several years. But what we can also do is we can say, you know what, this innovation by itself is quite good, and that one is quite good, but hey, if we put them together, think about what we could do. And I think that the next stage is to say, okay, if we can duplicate this model that we have for CABI in the aging and brain health space in other spaces, because you do need that kind of target, then what you can do is say, okay, well, what's working in aging and brain health, hey, that could also be useful in schizophrenia. That could also be helpful for depression or ADHD or other kinds of areas of brain health. So that's in essence what we're doing. The very one last thing, just I think, which is kind of the secret sauce of our success, is whereas a lot of organizations, solution accelerators, innovation accelerators, push companies out, we've recognized that you need to have the push and the pull. And so a huge amount of the work that we do, and this comes back to the different kinds of funding, is in creating a culture of innovation to be able to accept and receive those innovations. So if I'm working, for example, with a personal support worker in a long-term care home who has an idea for an innovation, the innovation may go nowhere, honestly, but it changes that person's mindset so that now when they are approached with another sort of innovation that does come forward, they're more welcoming of it. And we always try to put the end users in the very middle of everything. So nothing is being designed and advanced in our ecosystem without making sure that we're bringing older adults, caregivers, people with dementia, systems, health providers into the innovation process. So that's, in a nutshell, what we do.
No, and quite impressive, and certainly a lot of key points that you touched on. I mean, I will, as we're moving towards Marco now, a few things that I would like to sort of now build on from what you said. One was, how do you get how do you get sort of these various funding sources in place? And you mentioned push-pull. I mean, one thing we haven't discussed on the innovative financing, I should have mentioned in my presentation, is this advanced market mechanisms, commitments. I mean, that's actually how the COVID vaccines ultimately made it to market, because there was by the governments and the EU in particular as well, but also the US government, they made advanced purchase orders before the vaccines were developed. So they created the demand, they gave visibility that there will be a price point, there will be a volume point, and that actually brought in the sort of, also Tarek's point, that actually gave the pharma companies so that visibility to then put in their resources to work. So I think, in terms of push-pull, I mean, I don't know whether anybody in the audience would like to, in the panel would like to further build on that, but I would love to hear, because that seems to be maybe something in the brain economy that we need to maybe also look at. The other thing is that you were saying that, how do we actually build on the source of innovation and those who are maybe sort of unusual source, so that it's not people in the labs, but actually people close to the patients. And it would be lovely to hear from those of you who are maybe in that space, how do we, and this is then maybe also from an investor perspective, how do we actually preach to the non-convert? Because I think in this audience we may have, people are pretty much buying into the brain economy and that we should invest in it. Marco, what do you do to actually broaden that group to those investors who have maybe never thought of it and are saying, this all sounds, what's the investment strategy? Show me the deals. How do you do that?
That's a difficult question, but I think it's a difficult problem that we're facing here, and it's a macro problem. And if there's one message that comes out loud and clear from this morning, is that there is no silver bullet. It's a multidisciplinary approach. It's the brain is a highly complex organ that we understand very little, and there's so many determinants to brain health or mental health conditions in general that we have a long way to go. And yes, there's reasons to be optimistic now. because indeed we see more approvals and we see more capital flowing into the space and bigger deals happening. At the beginning of the year, there were 2 big deals announced by BMS and AbbVie in the space of schizophrenia, actually. So in that sense, you know, it's good to see that. And yet, I think there's still, quite a gap to close, because if you look at the funding overall that goes into brain health and mental health, and brain health more so, but mental health, it's still lagging. And we're talking about a 10x difference between oncology and mental health when we talk about pharmaceutical spending or even indeed total spending. So there is a lot to do. And I think we're burning the candles on both ends, because on one hand we have the prevalence of mental health in the younger populations growing, and we've seen it after COVID very, very clearly. And then we have the tsunami of the aging population that will be disproportionately affected by neurodegenerative conditions. So there's a lot more that we need to do. Then the question is, you know, how do you mobilize capital, and where does innovation come from? And I think there we need to be really pulling all levers, I would say. Innovation doesn't tend to come from the incumbents or the large companies, and this is not to say that they don't play a role in driving innovation or supporting innovation. It's just to say that typically innovation comes from more agile and smaller companies, and we need to therefore find mechanisms to support that. Okay. The one big challenge is that we're talking about very long cycles that don't lend themselves well to the venture capital, let's say, or indeed private equity horizons. Now, when we talk about biotech, I think that's one thing. When we talk about health tech, okay, or mental health tech, or brain tech, you know, we talk about, that's where I think we don't have super good clarity as to what we want to do. Because biotech, there is a regulatory pathway, and there is a reimbursement pathway, and there's a market at the end, and there's a golden pot. You know, at the end of the rainbow, if you hit it's hard to get there, and it takes 10, 15 years, but there is a mechanism for these drugs to be accessed. Speaking of access, I think we have a big problem, because yes, we need to continue investing in innovation, but we have a lot of good innovation and good interventions that are simply not accessed or accessible to many individuals that are in need. So how do we close that gap of access? And I think that's where technology can really play a big role, okay? And in supporting people suffering with mental health. And we need to find, this morning, I think Kana was talking about scaling what works. We're horrible at scaling, you know, technology, or picking, let's say, the winners and finding mechanisms to scale this. So I guess what I'm working on right now is, amongst other things, trying to bridge the gap between the venture capital community and the entrepreneurs. But I'm also really dedicating my time and effort and thinking behind how do we consolidate the industry a little bit? How do we create a platform to pick some winners and make them work together and collaborate? Because I do believe firmly that we have a lot of point solutions that, if they were combined from the perspective of the customer, you know, would be a big win. So right now, consolidation is not very attractive to private equity, because many of these companies are unprofitable and subscale. At the same time, it's not attractive to the VCs, because that's not what they do. They don't roll up companies. So how do we, the call to action here is, how do we create a platform to bring together some good companies that can work together, that are willing to work with one another, and present a united front vis-a-vis prospective customers. And the last point I would say is market access and reimbursement. I mean, there's a lot of barriers still there, okay, on how to fund innovation on the front end, but also how to pay for innovation at the back end. And yes, to your point about push and pull and commitments up front, I mean, sense of urgency and commitments that governments are willing or may not be willing to do on paying for innovation downstream. I mean, I'm not sure we're there yet. There's a way to go, and we need more patient capital. We need more collaboration, and we need also mechanisms to pay for transformational to incentivize transformational innovation more than we do today. That's my recommendation is collaboration. We talked about consolidation and, activating more venture money and more private equity in the space.
A lot to do. Thank you very much, Marco. Moving maybe to Kwame first. You bring in a very interesting perspective, both as a consultant at KPMG and also from your experience in Ghana, I believe, Africa. But maybe if you could zoom in, if you had to advise your clients when they come into the brain economy on what it means to have a return on investment, how do you calculate return of investment in the brain economy? Do we need actually new ways of capturing the real return? If you could maybe, and also share any other lessons learned from Africa or the work that you do.
So yeah, I think one emergent topic that I work with is ESG. And with ESG, the G part seems to be what challenges people a lot, right? So now everybody puts out an investment pack or anything and just mentions ESG and just write things. But as we look into, as we sit in boardrooms, one of the things that I personally seek to convince leaders on about is how are you taking care of your people? And what is the quality of people you have? Because continuously, quality of people is going to contribute to quality of the organization, right? So I think for a return on investment perspective, from what we've had today, a few things. Brain health is ultimately super important for everybody. We need collaboration, I think that has been mentioned there. And for leaders that run organizations, countries, I think it's important to recognize that the healthier the brains of people you have, the better. And that equates to that return on investment. But I think from an African perspective, I think it's clear that just if you, by 2030, Africa will have about 40% of the youngest population. And there's so much potential in Africa in terms of, first of all, looking at our cultural dynamics. Our cultures are very strong. And the stronger the culture, it has an impact on the brain health as well. Good and bad. Good in the sense that there's more support from family. Bad in the sense that certain things are looked at from a stigmatizing perspective. People don't appreciate or understand brain disorders, and it becomes a big problem. So I think there's a huge opportunity for us to look at Africa because of the number of young people there. Africa has huge potential, and also the positioning about culture, which really impacts it and makes it very unique in terms of dealing with that space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, indeed. I think also building on the, was it Augustine's presentation, that we do need maybe really more diversity of, in the research and in the data, and Africa would be a great place to really bring that. Moving now to sort of the hardcore investors, right? Who really are, but we start maybe on the softer side before we move to Eric and where the real financial investors come in. So starting with Jonathan, who is a partner at Dementia Discovery Fund. A very interesting initiative, Jonathan. If you could tell us how it came about, what it does. Are there opportunities for early stage dedicated investors like yourselves who understand the science and bring in the finance, which is very often the sort of, you may have investors who don't understand the science, but I'm sure that in your case, you have the right investor, you have the right people who make those investment decisions given your very specialized focus. So what is the Dementia Discovery Fund, and how do you come into this space?
Well, thank you for that introduction and for the opportunity to share some thoughts. And certainly I'll start with an introduction to the Dementia Discovery Fund and a little bit of introduction to myself, but then I'll try to generalize what we've learned from the Dementia Discovery Fund experience into some discussion topics that are relevant to this panel and this audience. And so personally, I'm trained as a scientist. I'm a PhD bioengineer, but I've spent 18 years now in company creation, early stage investing, and impact investing. And the Dementia Discovery Fund, which is managed by SV Health Investors, is the world's largest family of funds focused on dementia and delivering transformational therapeutics for dementia. we've raised over $500 million to invest on this strategy. And we're enabled by the expertise, not just on the investment team, but also our network of venture partners, our foundation partners, our academic partners, and also importantly enabled by our limited partners. The limited partners are the organizations and individuals that have invested the capital into the fund. And importantly, that includes corporate entities like pharmaceutical companies. It includes philanthropic individuals and organizations like Alzheimer's Research UK, AARP, Bill Gates. It also includes governmental organizations and other stakeholders in the ecosystem. The Dementia Discovery Fund, the idea for the Dementia Discovery Fund actually came out of a G8 meeting focused on dementia. So it came out of a group of people, somewhat similar to the group today, trying to decide how we could tackle these very large societal problems. In that case, dementia, but overall relating to brain health. And I think when we generalize, it was about aligning incentives among the different stakeholders in this ecosystem to solve, in one way, a specific problem, but in another way, a very general problem. So how do we get those public institutions and those private institutions and those philanthropic institutions to have the same success metrics? And for DDF, we are a for-profit fund. And I think that's important and differentiated about our model is that we are simultaneously delivering impact goals, but also seeking to deliver financial returns aligned with market expectations for venture capital. And the onus is on us as an investment team to create those investment theses, to find the opportunities where we can align those incentives. And that's not every opportunity, right? We have currently a portfolio of 19 companies, right? But each of those companies, because we're dealing with developing new medicines, if they are successful, will have a catalytic, a multiplicative, and exponential, scalable benefit across society. So I think business model innovation is really critical to find ways to go from point solutions to scalable solutions, but perhaps also to align the various stakeholders in the ecosystem towards these individual point solutions that really will be impactful on their own as well.
Thank you very much. I think this is, maybe quickly, Jonathan, is your business model of your fund scalable in your view? Can there be more of those funds, and can they also be scaled to become multi-billion? Or is the science not there ultimately? I mean, we're trying to also understand, I mean, do we need more funding earlier, or what's
the answers of do we need more funding is always yes, right?
Earlier, I mean,
but specifically, I think if you're talking about investing in this space, I think, as Tarek said, the landscape has fundamentally changed in the last decade. So the concept for DDF is over a decade old, right? But now we're investing out of our second fund, and the landscape has fundamentally changed. DDF was created in part because of the perception at large, right, was that neuroscience was too risky, too time-consuming, and too costly compared to investing in other areas of health like oncology, right? And I think fundamentally those considerations have changed, and I could spend an hour talking about each of them. I could spend days talking about each of those factors, but they have changed. And so we have more opportunities, quality opportunities than we can fund with the capital we have on hand. So I do think there is a larger opportunity here for our model and for other models.
So I guess we're hearing that things have changed. So our perception that neuroscience is a difficult investment area that you may just burn your money, and not get to financial return is no longer accurate.
Well, I don't want to trivialize the challenges.
Yeah.
Right. But what I think has changed is the perception that of where we are compared to a threshold. Right.
Okay.
And I think previously it was extraordinarily difficult to get generalist investors,
Okay.
uneducated investors, uneducated companies to invest in this space. And I think even some of the educated companies decided to pivot and go elsewhere.
Yeah.
And I think that has shifted. And now we see generalist investors co-investing alongside us, investing in neuroscience companies. We see large pharmaceutical companies that had moved away from neuroscience coming back. And we see even in a very challenging public market environment, we see a disproportionate number of IPOs and public market capital going to neuroscience opportunities compared to historical norms.
Yeah.
So I think that there is this sea change in terms of recognizing the opportunity. This is a huge problem, whether you're talking about dementia or you're talking about mental health, and there aren't good current solutions. There's a huge unmet need. And that is in comparison to some other areas like oncology, where there's been a huge amount of progress. So, you know, in about the last 20 years, there have been over 500 new drugs approved by the US FDA for oncology, right? There have been 9 approved for Alzheimer's disease, 2 of which are disease modifying, and they go after the same target. And they only slow the disease by, on average, plus or minus about 30% in terms of the rate of progression per year. So when you talk about the opportunity to make a difference, right, which, you know, in our business model aligns with the opportunity to make a profit, it shows that the opportunity is there and people are recognizing that opportunity. And aligning those incentives is really critical to have these different players in the ecosystem work together. And, you know, to my knowledge, right, you know, you need pharmaceutical companies in order to develop, seek approval, launch, market, distribute drugs. So, you know, if we only focus on the philanthropic and public payer perspective, you know, there's a huge gap in terms of actually delivering, at least on the brain health side.
Yeah, no, very interesting. And a perfect way to segue to get to Eric and also Ronel. So Eric, when you hear that generalist investors are now interested in co-investing with DDF, and you look at your friends who are mainstream institutional investors, how does that, do you agree? I mean, do you see now more institutional investors actually look at the risk return and see themselves actually coming into the space? And what does it take to have them come in large volumes?
Yeah, I've seen a pretty big change in the past 2 or 3 years. So just to give you some context, I've managed money for wealthy people most of my career, except for 5 years, which I can interject what that 5 years was. About 11 years ago, I got involved with a place called the Center for Brain Health in Dallas, Texas. I see Mitch Elkheim back there. I just saw you last week. They needed some help on the business side to help them kind of get to the next level in what they're doing in cognitive neuroscience. And so this is 2013, and for about 5 years I was there. And I left completely fascinated with the brain, investing in the brain, biotech, just healthcare investing. And prior to that, I really didn't have much knowledge about just how it worked. Because, you know, biotech investing is not for novices, right? You don't want to say, I'm a distressed credit manager, I buy public stocks and technology or Google, whatever, and try to do biotech. It's a whole different ballgame, right? So I learned how it worked. And so over the course of the past 7 years, our firm has allocated roughly $350 million to healthcare investing, and mostly in funds. So we try to find the experts in the areas. So the Dementia Discovery Fund would be one that we would seriously look at. You guys opened and closed before we even knew about you on the first fund. And I'm going to give the lens more from a venture capital perspective, because I think that's where the most bang for your buck is on the brain side from an investment perspective, from a for-profit investment perspective. So if you look at just kind of the basic buckets out there, right, you have government grants, right, NIH, DARPA, DOD, I'm speaking more from the U.S. side, right, and then you go to the next level, you have private philanthropy, you know, people giving money away. And then there's a bucket that's relatively new called venture philanthropy, which is people that they'd like it for it to be a business someday, but their primary goal is for it to be, you know, move the needle from an impact perspective. And then you have venture capital, but in between there's been these new buckets that have been created. You have what you call angel money, angel investors. So these are individuals that are willing to take really high risk. Then you have incubators, which are willing. So you have different buckets, and they're trying to make money, but they're willing to take more risk. So I'm talking more from the venture capital, which is we want to make a return. Like, over 10 years, we expect our investors to make 20% annualized, and we're going to have lots of zeros. They call them donuts in the investment world. And you're going to have, hopefully, that you have one or two in your fund that really make your returns. And so when I was left the Center for Brain Health, and while I was there, so this was 7 years ago, whenever I talked about the brain and venture capital, people kind of gave me the courtesy listen and the little chuckle and said, that's a cute science fair project, basically. You know, there was really no interest in it. It was just too risky. You guys talked about some of it. It was just too risky. And there was a clear path with other forms of biotech, cancer, right? There's a clear path if you develop a small molecule drug. If it works in clinical trials and it gets approved by the FDA, you have a clear path to how you're going to make money. You don't have that clear of a path with a lot of things in the brain. And the hedge funds that we invested with 3 years ago said, yeah, we invest in everything. Oh, we don't do much neuro. They might say CNS. I hate to keep calling you out, Mitch, but one of your good friends neurosurgeon that we interviewed, like, what was it? 85% of the surgeries done by neurosurgeons are spinal. So, wouldn't you think neurosurgeons would do more like above the neck problems? But they're not there yet. That's where we're at, right? So it's spinal related. So, but what I saw is COVID increased mental awareness, mental health awareness, right? The stigma has been reduced. I think Simone Biles has done more for the mental health cause by not competing in the Olympics than maybe anybody. No shame. I couldn't do it mentally. Physically, I was there, but mentally. And then the Leqembi, the monoclonal antibody that was approved by the FDA, about 3 years ago now? So that was a sea change in the venture capital world because it gave hope where there was no hope that the FDA actually was paying attention to neuro. So whether it really actually does much is sort of irrelevant to the venture capital world because it gave hope to investors that, yes, there's a path and the FDA is willing to take risk. I mean, traditionally, it should not have been approved. I don't think. I'm not a scientist, but it wasn't quite ready for prime time, but it got approved. So the Dementia Discovery Fund was the first fund that I've seen that was focused on neuro. And big, $250 million, that's a big fund in venture. And so to have a $250 million fund, that was your first fund, right, 250?
250 million pounds sterling.
Pounds, sorry. So that's
but I think with a huge UK government check of what, 100 million or how much was it?
No. I mean, well, I don't know if we disclosed the exact number, but the UK government was actually not one of our largest limited partners.
But
it is very important in catalyzing the formation of the fund, bringing it together, but the bulk of the money, the vast majority of the money came from other stakeholders.
Okay, yeah.
And it was helpful that, I mean, your mothership, SV Health, is a powerhouse in biotech, and so you already brought that credibility to it as well. So,
and again, it was a story of how do you create a model that brings together all these various groups.
Exactly.
Right?
In the US, do you have such a model right now, like the discovery? Like, I mean, bringing different investors. Have you seen that?
Sure.
In the venture capital, I mean, do you have such?
Venture is mostly going to be in for-profit investment money. It's going to be family offices, private foundations, pension funds are going to invest in venture capital. But what you're going to see is like the underlying companies that you invest in.
Yeah.
So is the guy from Rice still here? Yeah, Motif. You know, their last round they took, was it NIH or DARPA money that you got along with? Yeah, so you got second round funding for a venture company. So not first round, but second round, and government funding. And they call it non-dilutive financing. Yeah. If the government, you know, it doesn't take an equity stake, and that's really important. So that's going on in the United States. And I'll end on saying that the past 18 months, I've found over 20 funds that are being launched that focus on neuro or mental health on the venture side. They're mostly smaller. I've not found anyone bigger than yours yet, Jonathan. Most of them are trying to raise 20 to 50 to 100. I've talked to the folks at Cabby. I think you guys have a great model. And it's very encouraging to see that because 3 years ago, I think that 20 number was 0. And
Yeah.
so it's real encouraging for me to see that space, and I want to make a return for my
Yeah.
investors, because I think that's the best way to scale access to people, is to create businesses out of it that have incentives to sell things so they make money and reach more people.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think one important
Jonathan, I think I need to give now
Yeah,
Ron the floor. Sorry.
One
But
important
one quick-
clarification. DDF is global. We're not UK, right? Although the
It's
first fund
yeah.
was pound denominated, we have offices
You're
in
global, yeah.
London and Boston and
Yeah.
invest globally.
Yeah. So moving to Ronan, I mean, it would be great if you could help us develop the sort of investment narrative, because what I'm just wondering, do we have the right investment story, narrative, when we approach now, new investors who have either been burned before or have never thought of it, who didn't have the experience that Eric had?
Right.
How do we get them to actually listen, feel FOMO, and want to learn more?
Thank you. I'm Ronel Golden. For those of you who don't know me, I'm founder of RSRG Consulting, and I help leaders in the nonprofit and the for-profit areas figure out how to communicate their messages in a better way, and then potentially figure out if they want to invest in different projects and ideas. So I think that the idea of communicating these messages has already come up a couple of times in the conversation this morning, and I'm really happy about that, because there are so many great ideas at these tables and in these organizations, but if we cannot communicate that to the stakeholders, then again, it's like words on a paper or like a bunch of really great ideas that are going to change the world. I think one of the two panelists already said there's no silver bullet. You have to literally, like your idea or your product, you have got to get into a room and you've got to think about your product and about the different stakeholders and exactly how you want to communicate with each one of them individually, what the best messaging is for whether it's government or it's a sovereign fund or it's private investors or it's a VC or whatever it is. What do they need to hear? And then whoever your end user is, whether it's the public or whether it's a payer, I think there's somebody from a payer here, you have to figure out what they want to hear. And I think that story has to be crafted individually, specifically for your product and for your time and what people need to hear. And I think an important thing that was also, it was part of one of the questions earlier, is you've got to build trust. Because whenever you're suggesting something that alters a human being in any way, people don't trust you and they don't think that it's altruistic. And I think that's the key thing, is how do you get people to trust what you're telling them? So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that when we think about communications, it's always an afterthought. It's like, oh, we have a great product, a great solution, we're going to sell it to these groups and these people and everybody's going to invest, except that there was not a communicator in the room with you from the beginning. So maybe your product cannot be sold the way you want to sell it. Maybe there is a massive problem that a communicator in this field would know about and would warn you about. So you've gone all the way down the road, and somebody might just come into the room and tell you, I can't sell this. I know these people, I know this market, and it's not useful. So I think it's really important to bring the communicators in from the beginning, have them in the room as you develop these ideas, as you develop the products, step by step. And either way, it's better to have a communicator that's an expert on the topic than to have a communicator that's trying to sell something that they really do not understand because they've never been in the room and they're looking at it from, the 1,000-foot level. And then I think the third thing is that this is a transformation, right? This idea of building brain capital is really a transformation. We're going through another transformation at the moment, and it's the green energy transformation, whatever you want to call it. And I think that we can look, as we're talking about communications in the brain health, the brain capital field, we can look at some of the things that the green transition did well and some of the things that they didn't do so well. Because we can learn a lot of lessons there. I think that there's a lack of trust in major parts of the population on this. And I think that the messaging could be tweaked in a way that actually speaks to all the constituents in a better way. I think the nice thing about the brain health or the brain capital transition is that you've got an immediate return on investment from the individual. Like in the green transition, you're selling something that might benefit the next generation, children that you don't have. You have to change things about your life. You have to recycle and drive an EV and not, wear fashion that you can throw away the next day, but you don't see the immediate impact of that. And with the brain capital transition, people can see the immediate effect. And I think that's a really important part of the messaging, is that if you buy into this, whether, whoever the stakeholder is, if you support this, if you buy into this, if you're the end user, this is going to have an immediate impact on your ability to earn money, to upskill, to, change your own situation in this generation today, rather than hoping that it's going to have an impact later on that we really cannot measure. So I think those three things I think are really important. The one thing that I would add to this is that convening is so important. And Harris Air, I don't know where he is, but that's something that he does really well, is get all of the right people in the right room. You've got to have everybody thinking, talking. It's not a 1-hour conversation. It's a 3-day in-depth. Let's look at this problem. Let's look at what the biggest issues are. Let's look at some of the solutions on the table. Let's look at what we can implement. Let's look at what we can kind of explain to people. So, so I think that's where we need to kind of start thinking about this.
Thank you very much. Now, this has been really very, very comprehensive by each one of you. We don't unfortunately have much time to go into a major next round, but call for action by each one of you. What do you think needs to happen to get more investors or more investment into the brain economy? We start with Alison, and we'll just, in one sentence ideally.
Okay.
Or 2 sentences.
One thing is to make sure that people understand the economic output. So just within dementia, right now it's globally costing about $1.3 trillion a year. And by 2030, it's going to cost $3 trillion a year. That is, as we heard before, the entire GDP of India. Right? So, and it's a huge problem. So making sure that that's there. The other thing I think is to recognize that we are building on successes in other areas. And we don't have to just be thinking about drugs to treat something. We have to move away from the sick care model to a health care model, to a wellness care model, and think more about investing in innovations that are focused in prevention, in early detection, as well as treatment and care. And I think that that's where we're going to have the biggest impact, because then that also, if you're treating someone with a prevention approach, or there's, and we fund a lot of these kinds of things, and this is the research that we do. If you are funding something in the prevention space for brain health, it's often also going to be prevention for heart disease or diabetes or other kinds of things. So making that case and recognizing that because all of this work has been done in cancer, one of the things we're doing at Baycrest is trying to take all of the advances in precision medicine with cancer and bring them into aging. So we're focusing on predictive neuroscience for precision aging now. We don't have to start from scratch. So I think letting people know we can kind of like leapfrog ahead, and there is going to be impact, is really critical.
Very good. Kwame, and I guess again, I'm looking at it as a non-certain nurse, as an investor now into this, and what you say, prevention. How do we monetize the benefit of prevention? Where's the financial return?
So I think ESG, as I said earlier, is a huge discussion point, right? So that connection of brain capital to ESG, where, again, as I said, on the governance side, you're looking at how do you improve your people? Mm-hmm. Because with quality people, it's quality output, mm-hmm. right? And that's how I look at it.
Okay. Tarek.
Yeah, thank you. So to come back and maybe enhance and stimulate investment in innovation in neuroscience, I'm going to come back to the ecosystem concept. And if you look, where has this worked? If you look at the tech revolution, South San Francisco, Silicon Valley, etc. If you look at the biotech revolution in Cambridge, Massachusetts, what are the ingredients? Well, first of all, good academic institutions, a lot of ideas, entrepreneurs, capital waiting to be invested for return on investment. So it is possible. And I think innovation in neuroscience doesn't have to be a philanthropy with money going one way and not seeing it back. I think it can pay for itself.
Thank you. Marco.
I think I love the movement, the brain capital and then brain positive economy movement. What is coming through is it's complex and it has to be holistic. Okay? And that is absolutely true, but from an investor perspective, that's very hard to grasp. So I think we need your help. We need to break it down into investable categories because investors need have simple minds. Okay.
Well, I agree with I agree with everyone else's thoughts already. I think from our perspective, from my perspective, I think, you know, in terms of a call to action, thinking about the next adjacent stakeholder or player in the ecosystem, right, and how you can work with them to achieve a bigger goal. You know, we're a venture capital fund, but invested in our fund are the downstream partners and acquirers for our company, right, for our individual investments, our companies. And I think that's really critical. And I think a second thing does intersect with communication. It's, you know, there is an interest from the investment community in broadly the idea of impact, right? But almost all that attention is going to ESG, right? And it ends up in infrastructure or clean tech, right? And how do we take that excitement about making an impact and have some of that interest translate to the brain economy?
Well, Kwame says that brain and ESG are connected, so maybe he's onto something that we just need to better develop, right? I don't know. I mean, yeah, to be seen. Eric.
You know, I'll use an analogy that'll age me, but it feels to me that the brain today is kind of where the internet was in the early 1990s. Okay, it was there. People used email. You stopped FedExing floppy disks to each other and started emailing things to each other. But it was slow and clunky, and not everyone had a computer at their desk. And look what happened today. So it kind of feels like we're at an inflection point with the brain, to me, just from being a student over the past 10 years. So that's exciting. And I'll say that the one call to action is that I think there's going to be a lot of promising drug development, you know, small molecule, biologics things. You guys are probably going to back them. But I think a lot of the solutions for the brain are going to be new and novel and hard for people to get their arms around. So anyone from DARPA here? So when we got grants from DARPA for neuroscience, they make us have a sociologist as one of the scientists. Because if anything you have works, people are going to have to accept it into the society. So a wearable, an implantable, psychedelic. SciMed Ventures is here. That's not all you do anymore, but I know SciMed Ventures is a promising new venture capital fund that, so there's I always joke, like, you know, maybe Timothy Leary was right. He was just 60 years too early. If anyone knows who Timothy Leary is from the 60s. I don't know. But so I think it's, I feel like we're at an inflection point, but I think that it's going to take, we were talking to someone about driverless cars, right? There's going to be this, it's not going to be, some of this stuff is not going to be from taking an IV and taking a pill. A lot will, but a lot of the stuff that I'm seeing that's really compelling is exciting. Ultrasounds, transcranial magnetic stimulation, electricity, wearables, implantables, Neuralink. So putting a chip in your brain is a lot harder to think about than, you know, but then like think about, like, if a doctor said you needed a pacemaker, you wouldn't think twice about it, right? And there's people that have pacemakers for the vagus nerve stimulator right now, and they're having a hard time getting big pharma excited about it because they're like, I don't know if I can sell an implantable, right? I need something a little bit smaller, like a mini robot. And so give them funding to do more work. So I'll just say that my call to action is it's going to be big change, societal change, messaging is important, but it's very exciting. I'm very, very excited.
I'll just really do a summary, I think, of what everybody already said. I think that you have a lot of different constituents and audience members. Figure out what they want to hear, how they want to hear it, what is the language that they understand. Don't assume that because it's a great solution, they're going to understand what you're saying to them, and then provide that messaging to them in a clear, actionable way, and then give them a call to action the way that you did. That's what I would add.
Thank you very much. You've been a fantastic panel. I don't know whether, Pavel, we have any time for questions, because there are a few people who are eagerly waiting. I don't know, Pavel, you...
If we all agree that we will eat quickly, then yes.
So please keep your questions short, if I may, or comments short, and equally the answers. So we'll start maybe behind you first, and then Rim, and then this gentleman here. Oh, there's also Jillian. Yeah, okay. And 5.
Thank you. Sanskriti Thakur, Tower Capital. We invest in growth equities and generational health. We see some really exciting deals in brain health being part of a generational outcome, but we've had to really creatively think about our traditional allocation methods. These deals are coming in really multidisciplinary. They have many facets that we're not typically used to allocating as traditional biotech investors. So we found ourselves having to reteach our teams. And I'd like to ask you, what have you had to unlearn when you were making these investments to get that, massive return for your investor, but also to develop the economy?
So who is best placed? Is it Jonathan? Is it Eric? Is it Marco?
I'm going to wing it here. I don't, I think that I don't know about the unlearning part, but I'll say that what scientists have told me, just broadly scientists, is that most of the truly creative scientists, a lot of them are attracted to neuroscience because of the unknown, right? Because I think what unlearning is almost like, it's like the opposite. What do we need to learn about the brain, right? So I kind of use the analogy, we're back at the internet, early 90s. We're basically at the heart in 1960, I think, with the brain, right? Did you know in 1960 people thought exercise would kill you, right? And I'm not joking. There's a guy in Dallas that wrote a book called Aerobics, and he almost lost his medical license. And then he did a scientific study that said, sure, yeah, they thought marathoners were risk takers, Like, why don't you just jump out of a parachute without a parachute? So I think I think you have a good question, but I think it's more like we have so much to learn about the brain that in the investment models, though, it's interesting because, like, venture capital, is your firm in venture or more growth equity? Okay, so any venture capital, not just biotech, any venture capital is long-term, 10 years minimum. So they set up a fund. You ever look at it in terms of a venture capital fund, it's a 10-year life with the general partner can extend it out another 2 to 4 years. So 14 years, right? So this stuff is all long-term, and so the brain stuff probably is even more longer-term. So when I see people say you got to have a long-term time horizon, I'm like, yeah, it's true, but anything venture-wise, you have to. So I think it's learning to have that long-term time horizon. But I think that anyone that's experienced in biotech and venture already is used to that. But growth equity is different, right? Because you might expect an exit in 3 to 5 years. In venture, you're going to be darn lucky to have an exit in 3 to 5 years. You might have an up round, but up rounds don't generate carry for your firm.
So, given that, let's group the questions. So each ask a question, but we'll group them and then have, because I think otherwise we won't have the time. So Rim, quick question.
Very quick question to Kwame, maybe to Jonathan. You mentioned the ESG, but you focused on the G part, which is the governance part. You didn't mention anything about the S, which is the social part. How do you see this interaction? Because when I thought about ESG at the beginning, I thought less of the governance and more of the social.
Social, okay, so social. You? Introduce yourself if you want.
I'm a PhD student at the Medical University of South Carolina, and in my early medical years, one of the things that we're taught now in medical school is social determinants of health are a much larger component of health outcomes than the actual healthcare delivery. And so, my question is, how can we begin to identify stakeholders and investors who are going to be willing to invest in some of these social and environmental changes that need to happen, and honestly, even in funding the research that needs to be done in kind of preclinical models to demonstrate the importance of doing this in neuroscience research, when there is not a clear, tangible return on investment that any individual is going to get from investigating these social and environmental determinants.
Okay. This gentleman, and then there's also Gillian. If there's an yes, okay. Okay. Can we maybe share microphones? Let me give you this one.
Thank you. I'm Lucia. I'm from University of Cambridge, so way across the ocean. I wanted to touch on a very similar topic from an investor's viewpoint. Do you think about a lot about accessibility, bringing back to the concept of brain capital, brain economy. It's very much influenced by socioeconomic determinants, and thinking about accessibility on a worldwide, national, and individual level, so that it would be an opportunity to actually gain the most of that brain capital, rather than kind of, benefiting the ones who are already at a very good stage in their lives. So, could you reflect a little bit on that?
Hi, my name is, you hear me? So my name is Mohammed Chata. I'm a neuroscientist and experimental psychologist and trying to be an entrepreneur. I'm not sure if I'm gonna succeed or not. So we're talking here about brain economy. So the question is, how do you define the unit of the brain economy? Because you need a unit that you should exchange, and based on that unit, you would shorten the feedback loops from top down and bottom up approaches. So what is the unit of the brain economy? What do you think that would be?
And we have Gillian. This is actually more of, I'm Gillian Manis. I run a venture fund in Silicon Valley. I'm a Dean's Fellow at Stanford Medical School, and I'm also the U.S. advisor for the Innovation Fund, European Innovation Fund, which is how I know Shiva. And in Luxembourg, literally Shiva said to me, get to this brain summit. And I thought, okay, I'll do that. And I'm so glad I did. But all I want to say is just one thought, which is actually a positive one, is that with the acceleration of AI, that clinical trials will become much more adoptive, efficient, patient-centric. And I think that's going to help us to gain much more faster treatments, more cost-effective treatments, and in essence, democratize healthcare to a certain extent. So I think that the investment into the neuroscience right now and all across the healthcare spectrum is exactly where we should be prioritizing. And I think that we will definitely see more tangible ROIs because of AI and other different types of levers.
Thank you very much. And Harry's told us we should make 5 new friends. Gillian should certainly be one of them. If you want to, get money into the space. So we got some really interesting questions. And is anybody else who has no? Okay. Who are the courageous people who would like? There's definitely the S angle, and we need different perspectives. Yeah. Okay.
So by no chance meant that the G is the most important. Because if you're an organization that really has a position on ESG, it has to be all 3. But the reason why the G always becomes quiet, and therefore I try to amplify it, is that the people with the authorities sit on the board, they have the ability to drive change in these businesses, right? So, it's easier for them to decide what they are doing for the environment, what they are doing in the society. But if they have a view on, say, brain economy is an emergent topic, they will invest in it. They will look for good people. They'll take care of people in ways that improve that. So that's where the connection is. And I think he made a point, Jonathan made a point with regards to people already know about ESG. There are regulators behind it already. So if you're able to link that to the brain economy, you have a driver that will be more effective, because regulators are demanded, and now there's IFRS S1, S2 already there. People are required to put that out. So if you are required to put that out and you can see the link to brain economy, it will be propelled. So that's what I meant. So S is super, super important. Otherwise, your ESG is not in sync.
And I would just say on the S, one of the reasons that we have this, we call it the LEAP, the Lived Experience Advisory Panel, where we train older people, caregivers, people with lived experience, how to think about innovation, how to think about investing, and so on and so forth. Learning the basics of AI is because we want to make sure, again, that they are at the center of innovation. So that's part of what we're doing on that S, is bringing them into it from the very beginning. So to your point, making sure that all of the relevant folks are at the table from the beginning so that when the marketing is starting to be planned, they're already chatting with the people who are going to say yay or nay. The other thing there, though, is, and this is, I think, brought up in the new paper that was just released yesterday, the importance of broader education. There'll be a panel on that later today. One of the things we do in Baycrest Academy is and CABI, a lot of public education. So we have a Defy Dementia program, which is free, open to everybody, and it shares information about the fact that at least 45% of the risk for dementia can be attributed to modifiable lifestyle changes and or treatment of diseases like diabetes or issues like high cholesterol. So it's raising awareness, but it's also raising awareness of the bank manager, of the person who's at the grocery store, of everybody, so that they understand what all of these issues are. So social, I see the S as really big. And the last thing, just because you didn't ask about the E, but the E is important too, because there's all these interactions, right? So yeah.
So then we have accessibility and the environment. Yeah.
Maybe just one last comment. Just want to maybe talk about one element that is often overlooked when making a case for investment in neuroscience. We tend to reason most of the time regarding a particular concept that is going to be hit patients in 10 to 15 years with the knowledge of today, with the barriers of today, with all hurdles, regulatory hurdles of today. But this is going to be ready in 10 to 15 years. A lot can change. A lot of the disorders that we deal with today, or the labels for some of the medication we get today, did not exist 10 to 15 years ago. Now, an example is, we tend to look at psychiatry and neurodegeneration as two separate diseases. But there is a disorder called agitation and aggression and Alzheimer's disease. This is psychiatry in neurodegeneration. So, and we'll have new labels 10 to 15. So it's about communication, efficient communication and education. So that's certainly overlooked, and it dampens the enthusiasm for novel concepts that might be ready in 10 to 15 years. They're not ready today, but today is the time to invest in them, because it takes 10 to 15 years to bring a new medication.
Yeah, and I would just say about ESG, I mean, it is very important to investors. It's important to us. We track ESG metrics. We send out an annual ESG report. But that framework was not developed with the brain economy in mind, certainly, and minimally with health as part of S. So if you're talking about ESG and health as a subset of that, and then the brain health as a subset of that, I think it's a good starting point, the interest in ESG. But in terms of, again, call to action, what can we do? It's how do we redevelop frameworks or interest that puts this more at the forefront of people's minds and where they're devoting their time and capital.
Make sure we address all the questions that came about accessibility. Yeah, please.
Accessibility or AI? Because
well, there's also AI. I mean, do those people? Do you feel like your questions have been answered, or no? No. So, no lunch until the questions are answered. So.
No. So I wanted to. I just wanted to pick on the AI question, because I really, really agree that AI will change our lives in ways that we don't fully understand and appreciate. Now, there's one small problem in my view, that small or big problem that we're facing still. It's the quality of the data. I mean, we just don't have good data, and data sits, and it sits everywhere, right? And so how to integrate and leverage data to have good AI, because AI is only as good as the data that you feed into it, let alone ethical considerations. Then I guess, integrating data sets and understanding how to open the pipes, really, and make data more available across different domains, behavioral data, mental health data, clinical data, biobanks, data collected through wearables, patient or user-generated data. I mean, that is really, really a big, and yes, if we can do that and achieve that, then the language models can be built and AI can be effective, assuming we have good governance over it as well.
Okay, so I think accessibility, anyone? Eric, or?
Well, accessibility kind of comes down to, in the mental health space, I think there's so much that's not reimbursable. So it's the haves and the have-nots. The haves have more access, right? And so that's a problem we need to fix. There's some wonderful programs. Like there's lots of psychiatrists that just don't take insurance anymore because they have so much patient demand from people that can pay that why bother with insurance? So I think that reimbursement to me is a big part of the accessibility aspect. But of course, there's lots of, you know, drug pricing issues and cost. You know, our government, you know, we have a pretty big deficit, right? State of Texas, by the way, we have a fiscal surplus, believe it or not. But the one other, can I just mention one other call to action is that I think that what I've noticed is that there's a lot of heroic things being done at a company by company levels, lab by lab level, and the collaboration to me is lacking. And there's like a lot of like, this is my world and I'm going to do my thing, and versus like, I think that the power of collaboration can be really important. And I kind of analogize it to the brain as like, you know, we all know that we've got, what, 80 billion neurons, but, you know, where's the power? The power is in the synaptic connections, right? And so if all of these individual organizations out here are a cell, a neuron, and let's focus on that synaptic connection part of the ecosystem and work more together. And I see a lack. I see just turf wars in quiet ways.
If you want to have some lunch, we need to stop now. Otherwise, I think Pavel has given us.
I want to just, can I ask one question?
Yes.
Just to understand your question, are you asking how we can measure the output of this effort? Or is that what is it
Yes.
a unit of measure? Like, is
yeah,
it working
when you
or is it
could,
not working?
yeah, it's just like a carbon footprint.
Right. I think,
So there is a carbon footprint.
I think that's a great problem since you're a scientist. Potentially, you have an idea of how we could do that, and I would love
maybe
to hear your
over
idea.
lunch,
I think
right?
I am.
Over lunch,
Yeah.
maybe. Over lunch. Or the next panel. So thank you very much. A big applause, our panel.